Dollarama would have to remain on top of its game to repeat its past success. With our assistance, will we be able to ensure the future of Dollarama? My name is Muhammad S. Dilan, and our group consists of Adrian Nafis, Diva Shafia, Keishandra Nabila, Tisa Dahlan, and Jocelyn Tan are gonna analyze the risks of Dollarama in cooperation to assist in their decision making. And we will be discussing these following topics from introduction through recommendation. The following executive summary contains six key points, which are as follows: the key issues, model output, main goal, and also three strategies, three scenarios, and three decisions. We will begin our presentation by discussing the existence of Dollarama. Dollarama traced its roots back to 1910 when Larry's grandfather founded S. Rossi Incorporation. The business remained in the family and grew into a discount chain. In 1992, Larry and his relatives in management created Dollarama by transitioning the retailer to a single price point dollar store chain. As of November 2009, the firm's trailing 12-month revenues and earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization were $1.2 billion and $158 million, respectively. And here are several product categories that Dollarama offers. The number of Dollarama stores increased from 44 in Quebec to 594 nationwide, with minimal marketing and with funding that consisted entirely of internally generated cash flow. Dollarama's primary challenge was to procure a blend of merchandise at adequate margin while maintaining quality of product and consistency of supply. Along with, Dollarama's goal is to exceed our customers' expectation of the quality and variety of product they can purchase from $1 to $2. We also examine the SWOT analysis method for Dollarama, and the strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat for Dollarama is shown on the following slide. When opening a new store, Dollarama would invest about $400,000 in fixtures and leasehold improvements, and provide the store with $200,000 in initial inventory. A typical store would achieve about $1.8 million in sales in its first year and would reach sales maturity by the second or third year. Commodity prices affected the production cost of most of Dollarama's items, and in early 2009, after a few months of experimentation and in one of the biggest decisions in its history, Dollarama decided to add price points of up to $2. When compared to other US dollar store competitors, Dollarama excels in sales, offshore sourcing, and EBIT margin. The rest of the comparison can be seen in the following table. Dollarama's future plans included opening new stores in light of the situation and complications depicted in the slide. It all boils down to one question: should Dollarama continue its plan to open at least 30 to 40 new stores annually while maintaining the price points of its products, and how?
So now moving on to the stages, there are 5 stages in total, and the first stage is to identify the input variable. So in this stage, we determine all of the potential input variable. There are two kinds of variable. The first one is endogenous and the second one is exogenous. Endogenous is come from internal and it can be controlled. We consider downturn in business, company goes viral, staff shortages, technological investment, employee performance, and product defect as the endogenous variable, whereas exogenous is come from external and it cannot be controlled. Some of exogenous variable example include increasing commodity prices, increasing minimum wage, recession, inflation, and the rest can be seen in this slide. After identify the endogenous and exogenous variable, now we classify them according to the level. Each variable might affect the business from several factors include economic, political, social, technological, and environmental. Aside from employee performance, product defect, and cybersecurity breach, the rest are considered to have high impact towards the business performance. Then we'll translate it to impact or uncertainty matrix and plot all of the input variables subjectively. As we can see in high business impact and high uncertainty quadrant, there are 5 variables and those are company goes viral, competitor, natural disaster, government policy, and change in customer appetite. I'll be explaining some of these variable impact towards the financial model. The first one is company goes viral. If the company goes viral, it can be beneficial if they can optimize the exposure, and it will increase the number of sales. However, if Dollarama is unable to read the algorithm, they might experience a decrease in number of sales. The second one is competitor. As we know that in Canada and United States, a company like Dollarama was grown rapidly, so it can affect the Dollarama customer and it will decrease the number of sales. The last one is government policy. A concrete example of this government policy is trade restriction, and this trade restriction might take a short or long period of time. And if it take long period of time, it might force Dollarama to spend more money. So in this stage, we also determine the output variable and we choose operating profit margin, return on asset, and annual revenue growth as our output variable. Operating profit margin show the portion of profit from operation before deducting taxes and interest costs. Return on asset or ROA show the percentage of a company's asset. And last one is annual revenue growth, which compare the revenue from the previous year to the revenue on that year. Lastly, in this stage is to create three different kinds of path along with the input variable that have been chosen before. So for the path one is condition are the company got the positive feedback and also good review from the customer as they able to offer such a low price of product but also in a good quality. Then the export of import new regulation is blocking the business growth and it will alter the number of sales. And lastly, that there's a slight increase or decrease in number of customer as the customer is looking for an easy to use product. Then the second path condition are there since there's a negative review on social media, therefore it will influence Dollarama reputation. And Canada suspend the import goods from China, which make customer rely on Dollarama for a cheap product. And lastly, that there's a shifting in customer behavior since they're looking for a good quality product. So it left with a few customer in Dollarama. And lastly, in the last path, which is path 3, condition are government issue tariff, which increase import goods price, and then the import goods in China is considered in a cheap price, which attract attention from the customer.
After identifying the uncertainties with their impact to Dollarama's business, we would like to further analyze the kinds of situation and scenario that could be faced by the company. On this first scenario, the company is faced with a government policy that makes it hard for Dollarama to export goods from other countries. However, the customers and Dollarama has been getting positive exposure in the customer's eye. Therefore, from their general administrative expenses, there are no additional or significant changes. However, in the cost of sales, there will be an increase due to the tax expenses. And lastly, it's going also to impact sales as customer would like a high quality with low price products, and for the operating income itself. So in this part, we are elaborating more into the changes from each year due to the business that the key points and variables that are being impacted due to the scenario happening. The first one is the general and administrative expenses, which is going to be decreased. The cost of sales is going to be increased due to the tax expenses, and the number of sales will be in stagnant, and also the operating income. Proceeding to the second scenario is where the company is currently faced with a bad reputation due to bad reviews on the internet, as well as the kind of exposure they are having from the customers. However, the new government policy could help with their outsourcing and importing process because they currently apply a 10% tax. Therefore, it's going to impact several business key points. The first one is the general and administrative expenses because the company will need an increase or more of in the marketing expenses to obtain a good review and bring back their reputation. And the second one, there will be in decrease in cost of sales since there are no tax currently implemented in the importing process. And for the sales, it's going to be in declining. Also on the operating income since customers are currently shifting into a higher quality products. Like the previous scenario as well, in this part, we are elaborating the increase or the decrease and the changes in the business impact that the scenario is influencing throughout the years from 2010 and 2024. And as the previous slide also mentioned, the business impact that the scenario is going to influence is the general and administrative expenses, the cost of sales, the number of sales, as well as the operating income. Last but not least, this is the last scenario we are currently evaluating is where there are new regulations from the government that they issued a tariff a tax on imports that could increase in the price of commodities and imported goods. However, the government also lowered the interest rate to promote customer spending. So it could also be a opportunity to the company. However, from this scenario, there are several variables that could be influenced. The first one is cost of sales that could be increased, and also in the changes in customer appetite that will influence in sales, which is possibly going to be increased, and the general and administrative expenses. And also, we are here visualizing the kind of changes that the business is going to encounter throughout the years from 2010 to 2024 if the scenario 3 is currently being encountered by the Dollarama. To comprehend better, after knowing all the scenarios that could possibly be faced with the company, and here we are more of visualizing the key output variables that could help us in identifying and knowing what are the things that we should do to prepare with the kind of situations. So in here, as you can see in the annual revenue growth for the first graph, we are identifying all four conditions or are in business as usual, scenario 1, 2, and 3. And we can see here that in scenario 1 and 3, there will be a fluctuating growth in the annual revenue growth between the years 2008 to 2012. However, for the operating profit margin, it can be seen that in scenario 3 will have a biggest impact on the operating profit margin. However, in the business of usual, it is considered more stagnant. And lastly, on the return of assets, this third scenario, the first scenario is viewed as the most highest growth that could be obtained by the company. However, all four conditions show increasing in the return of assets. And that is all for the identifying of the scenarios and could be proceeded to the next step.
So, after constructing three scenario stories previously, we then develop business strategies to be implemented in this scenario and modify its financial model. So, here are the illustration on how we are going to apply these scenarios to the strategies. For example, like strategies 1 will be implemented to scenario 1, 2, and 3, and also strategy 2 are going to be implemented to scenario 1, 2, and 3. So all of these strategies will be implemented to each of the scenarios. So the next step we did is to develop three strategies. Here is the first strategy, which titled as hire consultant and reducing inventory costs. So in this strategy, Dollarama planned out to hire a professional consultant in order to help the company to analyze and perform further for forecasting and also to improve manager performances. And by executing this strategy, some of the components in their financial report are expected to increase as follows. So after the strategies are developed, we then test out the financial model by simulating the potential results. So there are three key output variables that are going to be affected by the implementation of the strategies, which are annual revenue growth, operating profit margin, and also return on assets. And after we implement strategy one into each of the scenarios, it generated a new percentage of each output variables. Some might be increasing or decreasing compared to business as usual. So next, we develop strategy two, where Dollarama should hire content creator to overcome bad reviews on the internet. And in order to create a positive brand new reputation, moreover, in the strategy, Dollarama also took advantage of new government policy, and they should maximize their importing strategy to obtain supplies and goods. And same like previous strategy, GA costs and cost of sales are also affected, leading to a higher GA cost and also reducing cost of sales. So same as previous strategy, after we develop this strategy, we also implement the new financial model and implement to each of the scenarios. And so there are three key output variables that are affected by the implementation of the strategy, which are annual revenue growth, operating profit margin, and also return on assets. And generated new percentage of each of output variables, and some of the output variables might be increasing or decreasing compared to business as usual. So moving on to the last strategy, which is increasing R&D and also cutting marketing costs. So in this strategy, Dollarama focuses more on the changing behavior of the customer with the interest of lower prices and decent quality. On the other hand, Dollarama also should discover new ways to solve trading issues as well. So after developing strategy 3, we also test out by creating a new financial model where the strategy is implemented to three scenarios. And as we can see on the slide, that annual revenue growth will be the highest in by implementing strategy 3 to scenario 3, and also operating profit margin results higher percentage by implementing the strategy into scenario 3, and also for return on assets it will be equal by implementing this strategy to all of these scenarios. And the next stage will be explained by my friend.
Okay, moving on to the next stage, it is the strategy implementation. Okay, so firstly, we're gonna compare the cost of sales before and after implementation of every strategy for scenario 1. So while implementing strategy 1 to scenario 1, it would lower the cost of sales. Moving on, implementing strategy 2 to scenario 1 would also lower the cost of sales. However, it follows a similar trend and increase periodically. And lastly, implementing strategy 3 to scenario 1 would cause no difference. Okay, so moving on to scenario 2, implementing strategy 1 would cause a rise and fall repeatedly throughout the years on the cost of sales. This unstable condition might not be good for the company. Moving on, implementing strategy 2 would lower the cost of sales. However, while being in comparison to strategy 3, it is seen that strategy 3 is slightly lower than strategy 2 in the cost of sales. Okay, so now moving on to scenario 3. Overall, all strategies implemented will cause a lower cost of sales. However, if you take a look on strategy 2, it follows a similar trend with the business as usual. Meanwhile, strategy 1 and strategy 3 has a less steep incline, thus making the cost of sales more controllable in the later years. Okay, so next is the visualization of key output variables for each scenario. For scenario 1, the annual revenue growth is more stable while implementing strategy 3. And moving on, the operating profit margin for scenario one is better in strategy one because it shows a positive feedback as it increase and decrease in a slight pattern. And next is the return on assets, and it shows that none of the strategies actually impact on the return of assets. Okay, so now moving on to the scenario 2 visualization of key output variables. As you can see, for the annual revenue growth, the strategies has little to no impact. And moving on to the profit margin, implementing strategy 3 to scenario 2 would generate a higher operating profit margin than the business as usual and a more steady profit margin. Moving on, implementation of each of the strategies would not produce a higher ROA than the BAU. Okay, and lastly is the visualization of key output variables for scenario 3. And the annual revenue growth for this scenario shows that the implementation of any strategies has no impact to this key output variable. And next, for the operating profit margin, it shows that implementing strategy 1 or strategy 3 has the highest benefit. And lastly, for the return of assets, implementing strategy 3 is significantly a disadvantage because it decreases the ROA value. Okay, and lastly is the visualization through heat map chart of every key output variables to every scenario and every strategy implemented, as it shows which strategy delivers the best key output variables and the least favorable key output variables.
Moving on, we have the strategy recommendations that we have laid out for each of the different scenarios. We begin by taking a look at the first scenario, where we do a comparison of the average key output variables put out by each of the different strategies. Here, we found that implementing strategy 1, hiring consultant and reducing inventory costs, brings the most significant changes to Dollarama. Notably, its operating profit margins rose up to 20%. Next, looking at the second scenario, when comparing the average key output variables, we have found that strategy number 3, which is to increase R&D and cut marketing costs, bring about the most significant changes to Dollarama. Most notably, its operating profit margins rose up to 20%. Lastly, looking at the third and final scenario, when comparing the average key output variables, we have found that the first strategy, hiring consultant and reducing inventory costs, brings about the most significant changes to Dollarama. Notably, its operating profit margin rose up to 36%. Finally, we have come to the last part of our presentation, which is the conclusion. Our final recommendation for Dollarama to be able to establish more stores annually while preserving their product pricing points are as follows. For the scenario social media as a game changer, we choose to implement strategy 1. For the scenario negative feedbacks along with new market demand, we choose to implement strategy number 3. And lastly, for the scenario new regulations, not much of an excitement, we choose to implement strategy 1. Now we have come towards the end of our presentation. Thank you so much Pa Andri and Pa Omar for listening. We are from Group 2 of the Industrial Simulations International class. Thank you for your attention.